Welcome everybody to this presentation hosted by the Architecture Foundation, titled Restoration as Resistance in Palestine. My name is Adrian Lahoud. I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture at the Royal College of Art. I'm really happy to welcome you here for this discussion. And I thought we could start by asking some of our terrific guests to introduce themselves. So can I ask you to start, Dima?
Sure, thanks, Adrian, and thank you for the invitation. Just quickly, I just started at the RCA as tutor for city design, and I'm an architect by training and background, and founded Hall of Forms as an architecture, as a kind of an architectural exploration of contemporary glass blowing in Palestine. Actually, in 2017, at the time I was working for Riwaq, where Dana is right now. I recognize that background. You know, Riwaq kind of brought me into the world of cultural heritage, and I kind of took a few offshoots from there. And now I'm in London.
Thank you, Dima. So with that, maybe we could ask Dana to introduce herself as well.
Yeah, thank you also for the invitation. Maybe I can start that I'm an architect. I had a BA from Birzeit University in architecture engineering, and then I had my master's degrees later on from Goldsmiths in research architecture. I joined Riwaq in 2018. It was by the time that Dima left. I think we never worked together. And also that was my entry point to the world of heritage conservation. Before this, I was in academia. I was teaching in Birzeit University, and I was also more active in the cultural sector with Al-Qattan Foundation here in Palestine. My first project in Riwaq was part of a bigger project called the Life Jacket Project in rural Jerusalem that is particularly focusing in this area. And I had to work on the village called Al-Jib. I think also Dima started there at some point, and I had to continue the work. So yeah, it was the accumulation of several people who worked on this project. And now also I'm leading a parallel research to this project in rural Jerusalem, which is called the Absent Map, Rural Jerusalem in an Alternative Narrative, which is developing along the last 2 years now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dana. Yousef and Elias, can I ask you to say a few words about yourselves as well, please?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for inviting us, and it's a pleasure to be here today. So we're architects based here in Bethlehem, Palestine, essentially focusing on working on public buildings and a big emphasis on construction procedures and looking at how we can extract local knowledge and local way of crafting architecture. And we run Local Industries, which is a network of industrial production, bringing together artisans, makers, and designers. We as well launched recently a radio called Radio Al-Hara with some other friends in Amman and Ramallah. And currently we're working on a project that will be launched by the end of the year, beginning of next year. It's called the Wonder Cabinet, and it's a platform that brings together artisans, designers, researchers, sharing one space and creating new forms of encounters.
Wonderful. The reason I think we've been brought together today is because I think everyone is working in heritage, but in a very specific way, really in a context of, let's say, extreme conflict over heritage, over different kinds of attempts to mobilize arguments around heritage in different directions, and that's something that is brought to a kind of clarity, I think, in Palestine. But of course, it's an issue that has broader relevance as well, beyond Palestine. So I think it would be really interesting today to really start with a kind of more focused discussion around a couple of projects that really might explain what's at stake in these different kinds of conflicts around heritage in Palestine. But maybe if we could get to toward the end of the discussion to maybe open up how some of the disputes and the materials, the things that you're working with, also might have a kind of relevance beyond the specific conditions in Palestine that you're working with. So maybe, Dana, could I ask you to start maybe by giving us, telling us maybe about a little project maybe that embodies some of these issues in a clear way.
Yeah, I think starting with the Life Jacket project is a good way because first of all, this project was launched in rural Jerusalem, and when we talk about rural Jerusalem, we can't talk about all the rural spaces around Jerusalem because Jerusalem is now divided because of the separation wall. So we don't have access or permission to work at the other side of the wall where the Israeli authorities are, but we can work on the Palestinian side, let's say. So when we started this project and initiative here in Riwaq, the whole idea was most of these areas are in Area C, and Area C is a quasi space where there's no total authority for the Palestinian Authority, planning wise. And also the Israelis are really neglecting these spaces. They do have some kind also of authority, but it's more like a military and kind of power there. So what we are working on was trying to see how can we work hand in hand with the local authorities in these communities. We are talking about, we started with first community was in Jaba, and now we are in the fourth community, going to Kufar Aqab, Beit Hanina, Al-Jib, Qalandia. And each community have its very specific condition in terms of lands that were grabbed from these communities, for example, problems of accessibility, also this kind of administrative neglectance. So also there are spaces in trauma somehow, because since 2003, since the end of the building of the wall, these communities had totally been cut off from Jerusalem, their urban center, their main urban center. And now they are trying to bridging themselves to another urban centers like Ramallah, for example, or some villages have been growing bigger and bigger, like Biddo, for example, which is in a way developing to become a new urban center in the area. So we are in this moment of change, and we are trying also to have our projects developed in a very sensitive way to this kind of moment. So for example, what we were doing in Al-Jib was more working with the community on what they need of the restoration and rehabilitation of their historic center. And sometimes it's really hard also to find the strong local bodies to work with, because most of them, they are really weak in terms of like the administrative bodies there, there's no finances. So you need to work in a very grassroots way, and with the finance of the people there and the owners there and their own potential. So now it's our third year in a way, and it's really impressive to look at how the communities, you don't need to look at them each community by itself, but you need to look at this kind of network that is connecting them to each other, like Al-Jib relation to other communities, and how we can plan this as one huge cluster that is in a way empowering each other rather than looking to a certain project by itself. So I think with this way, we managed to have some kind of relation and planning wise to have a more comprehensive understanding and plan for how to develop these communities in relation to each other in a complementary way somehow.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Yousef and Elias, like within your own work, there's you're kind of entering into very similar challenges, but really through a very specific lens around materiality, around construction technologies, around like labor associated with architecture. Could you maybe say a bit about, you know, about your own practice, maybe through with an example of a few projects?
Maybe looking at the current project that we are working on, it's a research project called Stone Matters. And basically Stone Matters looks at the way stone is being used in contemporary architecture in Palestine, and how the use of stone has been disrupted during the last 50 years due to the different political conditions. But it's, for us, what's really interesting in terms of heritage is the transmission of knowledge, and how we can maintain a certain heritage of the material and the technique affiliated to that specific material. So yeah, so basically we started this research almost 8 years ago, and it was a kind of reaction to a law that we inherited from the Ottoman Empire in Palestine, where we have to use stone as a primary material in construction. But we passed from using it as a noble structural component to today only a cladding of concrete structures. So stone is being only relieved to cover concrete, and is no more positioned as the main architectural component. So the idea was to look at stereotomy, which is the art of cutting stones to generate structures that are totally self-standing, and that have a carbon footprint that is considerably lower than concrete. And it's as well a way of trying to preserve a kind of know-how that is still widely available, and that is currently, or during the last 15 years, disappearing. And it's disappearing because there's a huge amount of workers. Most of the workers actually are working in Israel, and all these very skilled, this very skilled labor is basically losing their ability to work in a very specific way with stone in that specific regards, and that's because what's being constructed in Israel is very different. It has a very different approach towards connection to the land and connection to the material itself. So the idea is to reposition this idea of stone in architecture, but as well trying to be very much local in the way we approach the material, but as well have a wider lens in consideration to how this material has been used elsewhere in the region, but as well beyond, and look at this idea of transmission of knowledge across borders and across territories.
I think that's definitely something I want to try to return to, because it's also something that's very personally important to me, which is actually what is that, how architecture and all of the industries and cultures around architecture play such an important role in kind of generational continuity and transmission of knowledge. But before we maybe get to that, Dima, could I ask you to also maybe talk about some of the work that you've been doing using obviously different kinds of materials, but perhaps with a kind of similar intention?
Yeah, absolutely. So my interest in glass actually came from my interest in restoration and cultural heritage through my work with Riwaq. But actually that took me to questioning the larger questions around, for example, agricultural terrorism and militarization of archaeology that happens in those villages that Riwaq was working on. One of them that I was working on is also Jib and Jaba, where we also do the glass blowing. But the larger questions in my practice are around how archaeological sites that are living and breathing urban spaces in Palestine are weaponized for further land grabs and are used as scapegoats to further the Zionist narrative. So for example, a lot of them are between Area B and Area C in the West Bank. those that are in Area C are, the villages are in Area B and Area C. A lot of the time, the archaeological site itself is controlled by Israel. So you see the boundaries as soon as you enter the archaeological site, it becomes Area C. So it's immediately under the full control of the Israeli occupation forces. And what that means is there are agencies like the Archaeological Department of the Civil Administration, which is the agency that's literally militarized archaeologists that show up to archaeological sites with machine guns and so on. They exist in those spaces and take away the Palestinian agency from their own public space. And what I mean by an archaeological site being a public space is that, you know, they are used by the villagers in Sebastia to play football in the Roman Forum, to walk the streets and through the park, to have performative events in the Roman theater, which is not unusual because the Roman theater was meant to be used in this way anyway. So this idea of the archaeological site as a living space is something that I'm very interested in, and which is what we'll be looking at the RCA studio this year as our case study, starting with Sebastia actually. And for me, this question of restoration also is not necessarily literal in that we're restoring to rebuild, but restoring as a form of return or as a form of resistance for the individual and for the collective. And the way we're trying to do that through the studio is by building coalition and collective networks with the people in Sebastia, with people like Dana, Riwaq, to try to think of ways, first of all, to archive the oppression that happens in those archaeological spaces, but two, to kind of intervene in whatever way we can as cultural practitioners. And that will, you know, that'll happen over the next few years. But one of the ways I was trying to do that was actually through the installation at the Sharjah Architecture Triennial, which Adrian curated. And that installation was kind of looking at how could we get the ground to speak. So the idea of voices becomes very important in the question of return and restoring the ground. And that's where also Hollow Forms comes in, which is the glass project that I've been working on, starting with Jabba, and thinking about what is the connection between the ground and the human breath, for example, and blowing life into form is also very restorative in some ways, very healing. So a lot of the work, also, of course, history of glass starts in the Middle East, and I'm looking into that as material culture research and realizing that it's all very connected, obviously, to the earth itself and to healing ritual also in Palestine. So, you know, Dan also mentioned this question of trauma, and I think intergenerational trauma is a big part of that conversation in my practice as well.
I think that maybe that's something that's worth picking up on. I think probably most people are familiar with the very violent spatialization of apartheid, you know, whether through the wall, through racial segregation, through the division up into zones, the division up of Palestine into these various zones that you've referred to. But perhaps one thing that's not remarked upon a lot, but is exactly this kind of this temporal dimension as much as this kind of the spatial dimension of the occupation. In a text, Ariella Aisha Azulay spoke about, you know, every empire, every colonizer also engaging in a kind of war against that intergenerational dimension of the people it's trying to subordinate. And I think that's something that's also extremely clear in all of the examples that you're working on, because every empire, every colonizer also sees that intergenerational dimension that's passed on through cultural forms, through architecture, through literature, et cetera, as a source of strength and resistance in the people that it's trying to subordinate. And so the conflict over that, I think, becomes a really primary source of energy on both sides. So I wonder maybe if we could focus a little bit on that, and I could invite one of you to give the audience who'll be listening a bit of context around the ways that Palestinian people have been deprived of their own histories, or there have been attempts to deprive Palestinian people of their own history, of a relationship to their past, to their culture, through the land, through architecture. Perhaps, Dana, would you like to start? Because of course, Riwaq's work touches directly on this.
Yeah, I think like it's always important to get back to 1948 when we talk about the structures that happens between our relation to the land and history, and how the Zionist project materialized extremely at this moment as an event, let's say. So I think it began by the idea of forcing people to leave their villages, and this kind of absence, like you need to leave and you're never back. And then you have this kind of, you need to reimagine, to remember your land. Meanwhile, the Israeli project or the Zionist project is re-narrating this place, rebuilding this place, whether by bulldozing it and rebuilding it according to a biblical narrative, or more relevant to the, the land of return that need to be conceived by the newcomers, or whether as more a landscape that is more touching on this romantic idea of, what the land of Palestine should be for an Israeli or nation or a Jewish nation. So I think there became like these two imaginative ideas of what is Palestine, the imagination of the Palestinians themselves, which is more about memories and returning to the place and how it was, and another imagining it as the promised land. And I think also this can materialize to policies and to more administrative acts on ground that we can see up to now. For example, when we talk about Jerusalem itself, all the plans that have been put for the idea of the bigger Jerusalem, it have been touching on this, on how to make Jerusalem more the city that we imagined as Zionists, for example. So the plans of 2020 or Jerusalem 2050 are good examples to look how planning become a tool to re-narrate a city, but also to create facts on ground where a city is now having a different identity, different people. Demographically, you are in a way hiding the native people and the original people and bringing new people there. So most of the plans are aiming at reducing Palestinian demography, and we're still seeing this with bulldozing houses, not giving the right of living in Jerusalem, also through new settlements every day, expanding at favor of Palestinian communities and Palestinian land, and not having permissions for Palestinians to build in their own land and their own neighborhoods. So it's like an everyday policies that makes this almost impossible to maintain your presence on your own land. And you can't, in a way, see this outside of the bigger picture of the Zionist project in Palestine. And I think this also relevant to every single geography in Palestine, whether in the areas under the Palestinian Authority governance, or on the other side in land that was occupied in 1948.
Thank you, Dana. I mean, Yousef and Elias, I mean, is this something that you encounter in your own work, especially looking at, for example, traditions around Palestinian stonemasonry and these kinds of things?
Yeah. I mean, in our point of view, the idea is maybe that the occupation has evolved. I mean, the occupation is, for us at least, is no more something that is a global project that is imposed on Palestinians. It is that, but it's not only that. It's mainly, and what is vicious about it, it's that it affects personal and very, I mean, it affects the daily lives of persons, of individuals, in ways that are not in big projects, in ways that are not linked to depriving us of our own culture. And for us, there's no global project that affects at least in the construction world, for example, in stone construction, for example, we can say that the evolution of the use of stone in Palestine is affected by political conditions, but not only, because the use of stone as a cladding is something that is global. I mean, in everywhere else in the world, we have stopped using stone as a structural material, we're using it as a cladding. So it's something that is universal and global. We're doing it here, but here the only difference is that here the timing of the change in between structural stone and cladding of stone is linked to political events. And the political events is mainly we started using cladding in Jerusalem the day Jerusalem, the first big housing projects around Jerusalem for Jewish people coming in were built out of clad stone in order for these buildings to be in the imaginary of people included in the territory of Jerusalem, because Jerusalem has to be built out of stone. It's a law that is inherited from first from the Ottoman Empire, then imposed by the British Mandate. And so the territory of Jerusalem became de facto linked to the use of the material. And the change in the use of the material using clad stone was, at the time we had these housing projects that were outside of Jerusalem, but now they're considered inside of Jerusalem because in the imaginary of people, they built out of stone, so they're in Jerusalem. So I think it's maybe not interesting enough to do a shortcut between between saying that the use of stone is affected only by political events. It's not only the situation that we have here, it's global. And what is interesting, at least for me, is the intersection between global matters and local matters. Because when you realize that, for example, when you realize that objectives of capitalism in the Gulf, for example, or in the Gulf, for example, or in any other city where you have real estate developers building the city and no more architects having their say on the city, and this being here applied, and the objectives of this globalized capitalism being the same as the one, or at least meet the objectives of the occupation, then you realize that the intersection of different different actors or different forces come together in one sort of new way of thinking the city, and this is in Palestine we have also real estate investors that are also building huge projects all over, that are projects that are in some way look like projects of the Israeli occupation. I mean, the goals of the real estate developers and the occupations are not, with different proportions or with different effects, but they're more or less going towards the same objective. So yeah, so in the use of stone, I think now we're working on a project in the old city of Bethlehem, where we're restoring a building, and the knowledge and the know-how of the workers we have is very now is very fragile, or very neglected in a way. And so it's linked to political conditions, but I think it's the same all over the world. So I think it's very important to have this sort of step back in between what's happening here, what's happening in the rest of the world. And it also gives us a new way of thinking how should we react to this tendency locally, but also thinking about what's happening elsewhere.
As well, there's like this idea of, I mean, this whole apparatus, militarized kind of apparatus of trying to urbanize the city leads as well to a kind of a race of, or maybe a form of conquest of territory. So basically, the structure and the tool that is being used by the Israeli occupation to urbanize and to kind of conglomerate pieces of territories creates as well a reaction from the Palestinian side, where we as well try to go towards this kind of race of urbanization. And this is something that basically created a strong disruption with the relationship with nature, for example, where the history of the Palestinian city was linked to a certain mode of craft, where the city is crafted. The city is built with artisans and with makers, and the scale and the morphology and the forms throughout the city have a link with crafts. And basically, we are losing this kind of crafted city because we need to build on our territories, because from the moment lands are occupied by architecture and by building, we kind of preserve them from being expropriated.
I think, you know, what you're saying, especially around de-exceptionalizing Palestine or seeing Palestine as linked to a much more global context is incredibly important. And I think I was just a few weeks ago at an exhibition here in London called War in a Babylon, which is at the ICA, which is really about the kind of history of Broadwater Farms and the rights in Tottenham. And it was also remarkable to me, not just in the kind of space of like real estate development, let's say, and its effect on kind of like kind of deracination within cities, but also just in terms of policing tactics. And I think all of these different things that link what's happening in Palestine to things that are happening globally, also really interesting vectors of solidarity as well. And you also, I think it's very fascinating to start to see coalitions working across all of those different vectors at the moment. People like Strike Momo talking about a kind of global occupation or globalizing the Intifada as kind of one example. And in fact, Aisha Azoulay, in talking about that war on the intergenerational dimension of life, she was talking about the French colonization of Algeria and the deracination of Arab Jews in Algeria as well. So I think there's lots of really I think important work happening, and I think maybe this is something we can kind of conclude with because we're getting close to the end. But is all of your roles as organizers and designers at the same time? I think that's something that's also particularly fascinating. Before we get to that though, I also want to ask Dima if maybe you could speak to a similar kind of issue around the uses of archaeology, and you talking about like the kind of archaeological as a kind of live site of conflict, and especially the way like archaeology is used as a way of legitimizing different historical narratives around who has the right not only to speak on behalf of the landscape, but also who owns it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the dislocation from our land definitely was accelerated in 1948 after the Nakba, but it definitely also started before that through the colonial history of building the Palestinian narrative. And there's a really long history for that, but part of it is this myth building of what the Holy Land is. And a big part of that was the history of pilgrimage and representing Jerusalem as this mythical city before even being able to access it physically, having kind of, books that spoke about what Jerusalem is and were illustrated by people that have never been there. So this imagination of what the Holy Land kind of looks like or what it's supposed to narrate is very dislocated from the indigenous Palestinian community on the ground. And that lineage is very important, very violent. And the connection there with archaeology is very important because the history of biblical archaeology is incredibly violent and very extractive. And actually, this was accidental, but the image behind me is of the excavation of Sebastia from 1908 that was done by Harvard University. And you can see the women of Sebastia excavating their own land, carrying rocks on their heads and kind of moving artifacts from point A to point B. And a lot of those artifacts were taken to the Ottoman Museum in Istanbul, and all of the archaeologists' diaries are now stored at the Harvard Semitic Museum in Boston. And reading those diaries was very revealing. Obviously, a lot of this land was olive groves, and they had to request permission from the landowners at the time. And there were a lot of issues with Palestinians not wanting to work as labor on excavation, on top of already being really frustrated with the fact that actually their farm is, their olive groves were used to excavate, to bring out the value of the underground. And this excavation was funded by an early Zionist, Schiff, who was interested in proving the Bible. So this, this isn't, it's not the dislocation doesn't necessarily just happen because of the occupation. It's a very, very long history, and it's built on biblical narrative, and it still is the case. So settlers still come to Sebastia, to this exact location, teaching their children about biblical history and specifically a Zionist narrative. And it's superimposing onto the Palestinian narrative, that the Palestinians that live there on a daily basis, that are reforming every time there's an excavation. They bring back their olive trees, and they, last year, for example, 5,000 olive trees were burnt and cut down by the settlers in Sebastia alone. And the community is incredibly resilient. I mean, the olive trees keep getting planted every time. Actually, it's olive tree season now. It's olive season now. So I'm sure that there's always a surge in violence as soon as the olive season happens, because settlers come to Sebastia and to the agricultural areas around the villages of Palestine during this time. So obviously thoughts with them. But to really to summarize, it's the dislocation doesn't just start in the occupation. It's actually just expanded after the Nakba, especially with our with our generation and my grandmother's generation. But historically, it's 100 years before that. With the cartographic exercises that the British Army did with the Palestine Exploration Fund, even before excavation started. So it was a prerequisite to the archaeological expeditions in Palestine. And somehow we have to take control of our own narrative. And I think that's what our role is, kind of as cultural practitioners, is to, like Elias and Yousef are talking about, is present day Palestine. What are our issues now, and how do we use architecture to control the narrative and the present lives on the ground?
I want to ask a question around I guess political organization and its role in kind of design practice or cultural production, because I think it's also, all of you manifest it in really completely brilliant, but also slightly different ways. Donna, at the beginning, you were talking about how important it was to create a network of communities, to try to, in a way, almost reintegrate, groups of people, neighborhoods that have been segregated and divided, how important that was. Dima, Yousef, and Elias, in your own work, whether it's through, a kind of, exhibition practice, or also through something like Radio Al-Hara as well, becomes a kind of a vehicle for creating exactly those links you're describing before, yeah, of connecting what's happening in Palestine to situations in other parts of the world. And I think all of your abilities to move across scales and to see the kind of organizational part of what you do as actually fundamental to also the creative part of what you do as architects, planners, or designers, I think was really beautiful. So could I ask maybe you to reflect a little bit about, maybe to say a few words about in fact, whether you see yourselves in that way or not, or am I just projecting onto you? And how does that dimension of your work and your practice relate to your role as designers or cultural practitioners? Who would like to start? Yousef and Elias, do you guys want
to? Yeah, I think it's maybe just a reaction to that is basically, I think locally with at least for us, the way we work here, and I think Dima as well, and Riwaq, and I mean, there's thinking of a project in a way that is very much linked to community is the way we see a stronger response and a more anchored realization of projects on site. But I think what happened during the last 2 years with the pandemic, and for us, at least with the experience we had with the radio, I think we learned that the form of resistance that is the most solid one, or the one that creates results, is the one that is based on solidarity. And I think the amount of solidarity that we witnessed during the last few months was really incredible. And this is like very constructive in a way, because it creates a very strong base in which we can cooperate and materialize new forms of responses. And for example, with the radio, I don't know, you all, I think, followed this. There was this moment where this war started in Sheikh Jarrah and in Gaza, and the very next day we had like a program on the radio, essentially reggaeton and cumbia and and we were like, we just can't play that tomorrow. There's a war, there are people dying, and so we actually didn't have a proper response to what we should do and how we could react towards that. And the most obvious one was just to go silent for a certain number of hours, and just to be able to react and materialize a kind of response. And we just announced that basically the waves of the radio are open to anyone that would like to show any form of solidarity, but as well create this kind of bridge with other forms of oppression and injustice that are happening throughout the world. And that was really incredible, because the way the radio was nourished with these contributions was just putting these contributions one after the other, and the way they were put together created like a very unique and basically one voice coming together for so many similarities in between things that we fight for locally here and things that we fight for in London or in Colombia or in other parts of the world. And basically that's why one of the reasons we're starting this new project called the Wonder Cabinet is based on that a bit, where the Wonder Cabinet is, we are trying to see it as a label of production that is based on solidarity. So everything that is produced within the Wonder Cabinet, whether it's physical objects or research projects or new forms of encounters or an EP or anything, would be created in a form of solidarity, where the revenues, for example, would be shared in between the designer, the artisan, and the maker in a totally equivalent way. And this idea of contamination of knowledge is at the core of that project, and I think it's linked to solidarity.
Yeah, maybe in the same way, maybe just to quickly add on what Elias was saying, in the same way, these events were organized on the radio with people coming from different parts of the world expressing their feeling of oppression in different parts of the world, different oppressions, different injustices, but in one single unique space. In the stone, the stone research we're holding, we're working also on a project that is in the maybe in the way of thinking similar, which is it's called Analogy. And it's a project that takes different forms and way of constructing with stone in different parts of the world and try retracing their origins as a way of re-questioning the transmission of knowledge. So, for example, in Jerusalem, there's a church, it's called Church of Saint Anne, that was built by the Crusaders, and the Crusaders were very well known of being the masters of stereotomy and stone construction, etc. But we know that this church was built with some know-hows they found locally. And we know that we know of another church that is in France, which is called l'Abbaye de Beauchot, and that is very, very similar. The cupola, at least, is very similar to the one we have in Jerusalem. And so, knowing that in Jerusalem they used the techniques that they found locally, maybe we could question the knowledge being exported from Jerusalem to l'Abbaye de Beauchot to build this cupola. So it kind of flips the transmission of knowledge in a way that is not, let's say, supremacist, but maybe more like a sort of a blend of knowledge or a shared knowledge that is. There's another example in that same church, the kind of grooves that are around the main gate of the church. And the first example of these grooves, they're very specific in their geometry. The first one is was built by the Mamluk in Cairo. So these different kind of influences kind of put a sort of, I mean, at least a history of transmission of knowledge that is usually or typically set to something that is more that has more nets into its history, into its origins. So, I mean, it's the same. This kind of relates to the Sonic Liberation Front on Radio Al-Hara that has interventions from all over the world, but speaking about very specific situations in the world that relate to others, to other parts of the world.
That's extremely beautiful, and I think in a way I feel like we're all grappling with that challenge of how to understand our own histories, but also to uncover those moments where we know there's a kind of reciprocity of exchange, of kind of architectural knowledge, in contradiction to a lot of the stories that we're told around, like the way architectural knowledge is kind of passively accepted or kind of imported only, which we know is also not really correct. Dima and Dana, could I ask you maybe to conclude with just some reflections on your role as organizers as well as cultural producers?
Thank you, Dima. I think it's really important to recognize that the idea of self-organization is a very important thing in Palestine, because at the length of time after the occupation, there was this kind of political gap where people took their matters in their hands. And this became part of how the Palestinians, in a way, organize their matters, and it's continuing up to now after we have a Palestinian Authority. So I think an experience like Riwaq's experience is a good example of this somehow. Because when we think about the plans as Riwaq, we are 13 architects and administrative people who are working in this organization. And we are working towards rehabilitating and renovating 50 villages in Palestine. It's a national project. It's something beyond an organization, but this is what we are doing. So I think this is a very unique way to look of the power of these kind of grassrooted initiatives and kind of ways of working together with what we have. And I think also another interesting thing in the political situation that we are working on is also to be sensitive to the dominant political narrative that is trying to narrate our spaces, our villages, especially in rural Palestine, because there's also this kind of romanticizing rural Palestine. And then when you look at the investment, it's all in the urban spaces in cities. And also this is something that we are working toward, to relocate villages in the center of cultural production, knowledge production, but also development in a way that really feeds into the benefit of the people who are living there day by day. And one way of doing this is first to know how important their stories are, their narratives are, and the know-how that they have. And here where the research work of Riwaq becomes really important and really needed in this moment, because by documenting the buildings, but also documenting the families, the stories of these families, the know-how that we can find in the histories of these places, their relations to each other, their relation to the grand history that is written, and where is the role of the peasants in this kind of grand history, and to look at these micro histories as the real history of Palestine is something we need to invest in. But it also a mean to democratize knowledge and to democratize this kind of dominancy of one narrative, the single narrative, the narrative of the state or the narrative of the colonizer. And I think a good example was the research that we are now doing in rural Jerusalem within the Life Jacket project, which is called the Absent Map. And in the Absent Map project, we called the artists, practitioners, and architects to recreate the counter maps for Jerusalem and rural Jerusalem by centralizing themselves in the village itself. So you are in the village and trying to look at this geography through the history of this village, not the other way. Because when you look at the history of Jerusalem, it's also it's talking about the city, the history of the city. And when you look at the peripheries of the city, you may hear a little bit about the villages, the kind of crafts they had, the kind of events that happened in these villages. So through this project, the Absent Map, we are recreating different maps that are based on micro-histories of these villages, and that in a way celebrating their know-how, their practices, their geography, the landscapes they lived in and they moved through, also the different movements, not just of lives and bodies, but movement of materials, agricultural products. So it becomes a mean to, in a way, stitch these geographies that we are working in. It's a way to make people also work together to create this kind of map. And it's also a way to find a body of research that was built by the people, through the people, and Riwaq as the body that is in a way giving space for this kind of knowledge production to happen and to be documented. So I think it's just something I wanted to reflect on, that through this political situation, with the really absence of any firm and clear laws that protect cultural heritage, we need to step in a way to make this step to create our own laws of how we want to preserve this knowledge, what parts of knowledge needs to be preserved. And it's really beyond the material aspect of heritage. You can't preserve a building without preserving all the stories around these buildings and all the histories around these buildings and the connection between our generation to this 100-year-old building in a way. Yeah, so.
That's absolutely inspiring and beautiful, Dana. And I think it would be of enormous interest to people who will be listening to this discussion. Is there publicly available material on the project, or maybe how are you planning to share the project because I think there'll be lots of people would be really
Yes.
curious to find out about, what seeing like a village would look like in that context, and what kinds of stories would be emerging from it.
Yeah, we're having a publication where all the research material will be compiled, printed, and shared. But also we're having a website that we are now developing where the actual maps will be shared in an interactive way, where you can explore the geography, the narrators, the stories, the archival material related to each research. Some people are talking about the production of pottery, for example. Other people are talking about the grazing practices in landscape. Others are talking about knowledge relations to schools and these kind of excursions from home to school and all the stories around it. So I think it will be really interesting to put all this on one website for everybody to see. And the third thing will be, we will be having a public event with 3 public interventions based on the research that we are doing. And the interventions will be on the site of research in Beit Hanina, the Jerusalem side of Beit Hanina, in Al Jib, and in Qalandia. So also the people from the villages will have the chance to be part of this event and join it somehow.
That's completely wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dima.
Well, there are a couple of things here about solidarity that I think are in relation to scale. One is Palestinians standing in solidarity with each other, locally at least, and how we produce work. And for example, I won't be able to do any of the work that I'm doing without the archaeologists and sound artists and historians and urbanists and anthropologists that I'm working with. So it's no longer possible to kind of work as an architect as an individual. This at least in relation to Palestine, and not that it really ever was. And just the question of who an architect is, in my imaginary, at least in the way that I'm practicing, is definitely moving towards kind of bringing in archaeologists and all sorts of different experts as part of the architectural process. That's very important for knowledge production in Palestine. And of course, like Dana was saying, oral historians are a really, really important part of that. And sharing information and using platforms like Riwaq to continue the knowledge production, I think, is incredibly important. So thank you, Dana, for that. And then 2, I don't remember who was saying this, but over the last few months, Palestinians have had kind of Zoom talks and so on while the events were happening in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan and Gaza. And somebody said something about the feeling of solidarity, or being in solidarity with Palestine, and seeing thousands and hundreds of thousands of people in the streets as liberating in itself. So there's this almost like spiritual high where you when you feel like everyone is kind of falling into place immediately when we're needed. There was an immediate moment when we saw people from Palestine in 48, in Gaza, in Jerusalem, and the West Bank kind of stand together as a single unit, which is very something that we haven't seen in a very long time. And that was incredibly liberating to see, and even just emotionally exciting. And then having conversations with friends and individuals that had been, previously Zionist, and kind of talking openly about how they're having very difficult conversations with their parents, and that they're in the streets in solidarity with Palestine. There's something incredibly liberating about that. And someone said in one of those Zoom calls, I don't remember who it was, but Du'naha, we tasted liberation. We know kind of what that feels and tastes like because of the excitement around being in the streets and kind of creating those new networks that are changing everything in the way that we practice on a daily basis. And I can't exaggerate, when I say that it feels like the change over the last few months is exponential, and it's very exciting to feel that solidarity. Really, it means a lot.
Thank you, Dima. I think it's an amazing moment. I think the kind of solidarity between movements, like the movement for Black Lives and struggles for Palestinian freedom and autonomy are really just extraordinary. I never would have thought that when we co-authored the Architects and Planners statement against apartheid, that we would have 283 schools and organizations and practices sign. I think that, and so it's a signal of a long overdue, let's say, consciousness around not just the situation in Palestine, but the way Palestine, the situation in Sheikh Jarrah connects to Tottenham or Minneapolis or Ferguson and other places around the world. With that, I think we should draw this to a conclusion. It's been an absolute privilege to share this discussion between you all. The work has been incredibly inspiring to me for a very long time. So thank you very much, and thank you to Elias and Rosie and the entire team as well from the Architecture Foundation for supporting this discussion today. Thank you.